this evening, 5 young geologists, Alasdair Murphy, Locke Koopmans, Lucy Mathieson, Rob Webster, and Rory Changeleng. And they'll be discussing their recent dissertation to the igneous intrusions of Greenland, Southern Greenland. The title is Exploring Southern Greenland's Magmatic Past, New Perspectives from the Island of Tuttotooq. I'll let them say pronounce that properly. Now, this is going to be, I'm very excited by this. I think these guys may be the youngest presenters we've had. And I've no doubt that what we're going to see is a fantastic example of the standard of geology that has been undertaken now in our universities. And with that in mind, I would like to pass over to Alasdair first to start off. Thank you very much.
Cool. Yeah. So no pressure, eh? So yeah, we're a group of students at the University of St Andrews. We went to Greenland last summer, so 2019, to study some rocks of the Gardar Province on an island called, well, we were calling it Tuttotooq, so exactly how you were saying it. At the end, we were chatting to some locals who were saying that it's pronounced, so T would be a D, so essentially it's just dude, as in our word, Tuttotooq. So very close. But yeah, there's a lot of other words that we're not quite so sure of either. But yeah, so we're excited to be presenting today because this has formed quite a major part of our degrees and was something we were really quite into. And we'll go through the speak. Well, you'll see our faces as we're speaking because we'll each present a different part. But this is who we are, just on the screen there. This was very much a team effort. So we've tried to reflect that in the outline of the talk. So just briefly with the outline, next slide, please. We'll just give a bit of a background to the expedition, to what it took to get us there. Background to the geology. So Rob will just go through this, what is useful to know for understanding where we were at and what we were doing. And then this is the bit that we could each probably give a whole presentation ourselves, is the field results. So having been in the field, what were we seeing? What was our final outcomes, and what individually were we quite excited about? And then finally, we'll go through some of the lab work that we've been able to do. And this was the bit that we'd been hoping to stress in this presentation, but as with all things this year, COVID has managed to get its fingers into things, and so we've not been able to do quite as much as we'd planned, but nonetheless, a lot has got some really quite interesting data that he will be talking through. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Lucy, who will give a bit of a background to the expedition.
Thank you, Alasdair. We went to Greenland with a number of aims. We each had our own individual aims and the way in which we wanted to execute them, but broadly it was to investigate the geological history of the area, the mechanisms of dike emplacement, and also the formation of pristine mineral layering within these dikes. You'll see throughout the presentation that our field area really is first class. It is such a unique opportunity to see what is essentially a fossilized magma plumbing system right beneath our feet. Nature has been very kind to us indeed and exposed it nicely at the surface for us to get down and have a look and really get our noses on the rocks. Although with COVID, you probably need a mask for that now. And we've been inspired by the work done previously by Professor Upton and others who mapped it a number of years ago now in the 50s and 60s. And we wanted to push our own detailed geological map of the eastern side of Tuttotooq Island. In addition to the fieldwork, we also knew that we would need to do some lab work to tackle our aims. So to do this, our aim was to undertake a systematic sampling campaign and ship these back to St Andrews for the lab analyses upon our return. And as Alasdair mentioned, a lot of these haven't able to take place yet, but we'll see later on what we have managed to do. And aside from the geology, it was also about gaining experience in organising such an extensive expedition to a challenging and remote environment. So to put it on a map, our field area was in the southwest of Greenland, down here outlined by this little red box. This is where largely the majority of Greenland's population is concentrated on the southwest coast. And if we look over to the right here on this sort of inset, if you look in the upper right of this box, you'll see you can just about see the airport symbols. This is Narsarsuaq Airport, and that's where we flew to before jumping on some boats and dodging some icebergs to eventually reach the island of Tuttotooq. And our study area is outlined here in this blue box. Tuttotooq is not inhabited by humans, but there are a number of caribou on the island, and the locals say that when the fjord freezes over in the winter, the caribou sort of wander across the ice to the nearest town, Narsaq, which is this little red dot here. So arguably the most difficult part of the expedition actually took place before we even left Edinburgh Airport. There was an incredible amount of organisation and preparation involved from each of us. And this started with us seeking a source of funding. And the Edinburgh Geological Society, among others, were generous enough to support our expedition, and it would not have happened otherwise. And it is the reason we're here tonight, getting all excited about the geology that we saw. In terms of organisation, we had a number of things to think about. For example, just how much food each of us were going to need to sustain us for 6 weeks on an island. And then we actually had to buy this food, along with other essential equipment like tents and hammers and first aid supplies. We also had to get boxes to pack all of this into, and then also arrange this and secure it onto a pallet, and arrange for this to get shipped to Greenland well in advance of our arrival in late May. And after this was done, and around mid-March of 2019, we had to start thinking about the travel logistics, so booking hostels, boat transfers, flights, and even this was difficult in and of itself when none of us spoke Greenlandic or Danish. So each stage of the preparation really was a large learning curve for everyone involved. And now Rob is going to give us a background into the geology of the region.
Yeah, fantastic. So to summarize the background geology of where we went, so there is evidence of both the formation and the breakup of what's known as the Columbia supercontinent in the south of Greenland. So the formation around 800 million years ago in the Proterozoic is indicated by what is known as the Ulyanab batholith. So this is this significant granite body running through the center and thought to represent the root of a volcanic arc. The batholith, along with the samite and the peelite zones to the south, as you can see, have facilitated the interpretation that these rocks represent the Kettledian orogeny. This orogeny is not too dissimilar to that of the Andean collision zone. Continental rifting of this same supercontinent at around 1300 to 1130 million years ago is then further evidenced by many incredible igneous features which are expressed predominantly within this Ulyanab batholith host rock. So the products of rift magmatism here are referred to as the Gardar Province, and then they have subsequently, in the past many years, have been subdivided further. So we have two main periods of rifting which have been recorded. So there's the early Gardar from 1300 to 1260 million years ago, and the late Gardar, which is 1180 to 1130 million years ago. What I want to draw your attention to here is that the late Gardar, which has two major rift zones which make up what we define it as. So we have Narsarsuaq over to the north, near to the border zone, and then of particular importance to ourselves, we have the Tuttutooq-Llimaussaq-Narsarsuaq Zone, again to the south. So the Tuttutooq-Llimaussaq-Narsarsuaq Zone also consists of three main centers. Over in Narsarsuaq area to the east, you can see in purple, there's cyanitic intrusions which are exposed. In the center, you can see what is known as the Eriksfjord Formation, the yellow and the gray. This is a sedimentary succession with basaltic lava flows which are interspersed throughout. You can see the blue and the various colors around that. That is known as the Limaussaq complex, which intrudes through the Eriksfjord Formation. This is a fantastic layered igneous intrusion, which also plays hosts to economic concentrations of rare earth elements, and is in fact the second largest rare earth element deposit in the world. And then, most importantly to ourselves, we have Tuttotooq to the west. The first expression of rift magmatism on the island is that of alkaline olivine dolerite dykes. These are known as brown dykes or BD noughts, which propagate roughly at a northwest southeast trend, but we're only a minor phase in comparison to the rest of the geology of the rift magmatism. In a later stage, we then have at roughly 1184 million years ago, a nepheline syenite dike of roughly 500 to 600 meters width was intruded into Tuttotooq. This is known as the older giant dike complex. After this, we then have at around 1163 million years ago, the younger giant dike complex intruded. This is a mainly troctolitic body that reaches anywhere up to 800 meters in width in some parts. Primitive bodies such as the younger giant dike complex are often studied and considered for their critical metal concentrations as well. And so that will not be the last time that you hear about these creatively named older giant dike and younger giant dike complexes. They make up a significant part of everyone's topics. But also importantly to our story here is the presence of two sizable lamprophyric bodies. And also, along with this, the emplacement of a swarm of late dykes, which represent the last expressions of magmatism in the Gardar. Finally, just to conclude here, is that it is important to note that the Gardar Province provides us with a useful analogue for what we might see if we went 4 to 5 kilometers below, for example, the East African Rift zone. So to take us into a bit further, more detail than what we did, I'm going to hand over now to Lot.
All right, so with that in mind, we set off to Greenland and we did some mapping, getting up close and personal with rocks. We also occasionally imitated the local fauna that was around and mainly did a lot of head scratching and tried to figure out what on earth was going on in these rocks. But ultimately, we produced the following map. So I'm just going to quickly go through the main things that we found in our map in chronological order, and handily as well. That's the way that we'll be discussing it throughout the talk. So the basement, which is this Ketelidian granites, or this Ketelidian batholith, are largely Monzo granites and alkali feldspar granites here. So they're alkali feldspar and hydroclase feldspar bearing granites, which were then cross-cut by all of the Gardar age magmatism. The earliest, as Rob mentioned, was the brown dike, which is this small, I'll zoom in for it very quickly, the small red dike that we see coming across. And afterwards, the later stages of the rifting occurred. The first of which was this older giant dike complex, which trended roughly east-west. And that had this brown rim, which is cyano-gabbroic, so an alkali feldspar bearing gabbro, that hosted a central nepheline cyanite core. And the nephelines were really nicely euhedral in here, so it's quite an interesting thing to see. After the older giant dike, and the main topic of our talk today is the younger giant dike, and this intruded as this green color here, as two separate limbs along the island of Tuttotooq. Interestingly, we firstly identify, similar to what you have in the older giant dike, we have a marginal zone, but because it's so thin, it wasn't very mappable at this scale. But the marginal zone is a roughly equigranular gabbro, so that hosts olivine, plagioclases, and pyroxenes predominantly. There's some oxide phases and some other minor phases as well. This had a relatively complicated relationship with the host troctolite, as we mentioned, but we'll get into detail of that later on. The troctolite is, or a troctolitic gabbro, is a plagioclase olivine rich gabbro and has only interstitial clinopyroxenes in most places. Rory will start us off by talking about the northern limb of the younger giant dike, which within this troctolite had interesting ovoid pods of more evolved melts. And the southern limb had these, unlike the northern limb, didn't have any evolved melts, but these blue pods here are where beautiful examples of modal layering or a very strong lamination or foliation in the rock was formed as well. And so we'll get into details to how those formed and what those were later on too. And finally, what we found quite interesting is we also found a finger of this homogeneous troctolite that cut through the layered pod at Assorutit, which made it quite nicely to identify because of the difference in how they looked in the field. But this provided evidence that this younger giant dike came into at least in at least 2 phases. But like I said, we'll get into that later. And on that note, what you'll see is that there's really quite a lot of interesting stuff happening before we even get these large crisscrossing later dikes. The later dikes, as you see, are these black lines that come across, and they're really quite prolific throughout the map. Rob will give more detail as to exactly what the composition and widths of those are. Finally, the red crosses that we have here, first one at the narrowing of the younger giant dike here, and later this one off the map. Al made a beautiful small map, inset map of the area. Alasdair will give us some detail as to what we think is occurring at these lamprophyres and what they might tell us about the history of this area. Without further ado, here's Rory, who will give us an insight on these layered pods, or these evolved pods in the northern limb.
Yes, so here is a fantastic picture of what the northern limb of the younger giant dike looks like in the field. And what I'd like to draw your attention to here is the presence of these more evolved sections. So in the center of the screen, you see that the basement granite pinches inwards. That's because the younger giant dike has a pinch point in the center. And to the northeast of this image, we have the evolved pod at Assorutit, which I'll go into in more detail in a minute. And to the far southwest of the image, just beyond the horizon line, we see the other evolved pod at Krydssø. And so these evolved pods, as Lot alluded to, are essentially where the gabbroic composition changes and evolves into more into different compositions of cyanogabbro and quartz syenite. So a very simplistic way of thinking about this is this model here. And so we have the Ulinghab granite batholith, which has been intruded by our later magmatism in the Gardar, where we have our younger giant dike coming through, made of this troctolite. And what does this troctolite look like? Well, it's essentially mostly plagioclase, and these form a beautiful framework of cumulate needles. And we also see substantial primary olivine and then interstitial pyroxenes. And so this dike intrudes. We have wider parts and we have narrower parts. And in one of these wider parts here, we see differentiation further. And so whereas we have our original troctolite plotting down here in our QAP diagram, right at the very far corner at the gabbroic stage, we see that we have an evolution later on of melts going towards this cyanogabbroic composition. And so by cyanogabbro, we mean that we have potassium feldspar coming into the cumulate mixture as well, and we have less plagioclase. Also to note, the olivine content goes down and the pyroxene content increases massively. And the pyroxene also becomes a primary cumulate phase at this point. And so what's essentially happening, what people think is essentially happening, is that we have this hypersaturation of the pyroxene components. And that means that you have this rapid crystallization. Wherever you have a nucleation of pyroxene, you suddenly have this rapid crystallization forming these beautiful dendritic crystals. And this occurs especially at Assorutit, but it also occurs there's also primary pyroxene occurring at Krydssø. And so this is essentially what the Krydssø pod looks like, but at Assorutit, we have further evolution to quartz syenite. And so this quartz syenite has no plagioclase and is dominated by K-spar. And there's also crucially now quartz within the interstitial phases of this cumulate crystal. And so if you look at our QAP diagram at the bottom, we can see that now we've gone to the opposite end of the diagram and we've evolved towards a syenite. And so this forms a very simplistic way of thinking about these pods within the dike. And if we see this in a wider context on the next slide, please, Lot. We have the, here we go. We have the Krydssø pod here, which is Cyanogabro, and then we have a narrowing in the dike, and then we have the Assorutit pod of Cyanogabro going into quartz syenite. And this forms a very simplistic way of viewing the northern limb of the Younger Giant Dyke. What this looked like in the field is the, so next slide, please, Lot. So here we have the zoomed in version of our northern limb of the Younger Giant Dyke. And what we see here is essentially the diagram I showed you just in the previous slide, but in Mother Nature's context. So in the north, we have the Assorutit pod from the dark green troctolite gabbro going into the brown cyanogabro, and then the light green quartz syenite in the center. And then at Krydssø to the southwest, we have the cyanogabro occurring. And interestingly, in Krydssø, the cyanogabro is not homogeneous, but has modal layering and foliation, which I'll allude to slightly later. Another thing I would like to draw your attention to is the presence of these yellow units, which are evolved veins, which irradiate out from the Assorutit pod. These are normally sub-meter scale, but in two places they do expand to be about 60 meters wide. And these are thought to represent the very final stages of the melt crystallizing. So they're the most hyper-evolved sections within this Younger Giant Dyke complex. Another feature we have is some faulting occurring in the area. So if we look at the very tip of Assorutit Peninsula, we see that there's a fault cross-cutting, and this downfaults a large block from the roof fascies further up, and that brings some very interesting stuff with it. So now let's see what the Assorutit point looks like in the field. So this is a field image looking down the Assorutit Peninsula, and you can see in the distance we have the mountains of the Llymaussaq complex across the Iceberg Sea. And what I'd like to draw your attention to here is that we have this fractionation trend continuing with troctolite on the margin, cyanogabro, and then quartz syenite in the center. And unfortunately, the exposure was not fantastic at these contacts, but at the one point where it was exposed, eluded by this red box, we see that there's a very gradual transition over about 2 to 3 meters between these two units. And that would support this idea of a more in situ version of fractional crystallization. However, this may be too simplistic, as we'll allude to later on. If we look now at the very tip of Assorutit, beyond the fault, we can see what the roof fascies of the Younger Giant Dyke looks like. And this, very interestingly, is full of these large xenoliths of anorthosite. So this is rock which is essentially just feldspar, just anorthosite feldspar. And we see these xenoliths going from the kind of fist scale up to the meter scale, and even up to the 150 meter scale. And cross-cutting these xenoliths, we also have these evolved veins. So the very latest stage of the magma also intruded into the roof complex above, and is then fortunately being downfaulted here so that we can see it. If we look now at the Krydssø pod, this is an inset map of Krydssø. And what I'd like to highlight here is that we have a homogeneous pod in the very furthest east section. And then this grades gradually into a central zone where there's a foliation defined by the alignment of pyroxene and plagioclase minerals. And then as we go to the very furthest west section, we have modal layering. And this modal layering defines a synformal shape. This white arrow that you can see here shows the direction of the next photo that's taken. And so if we look at this next photo, we see the photo on the right has a view down the center of the synform. And so we can see this modal layering, which is shown at the bottom left of the screen. And this modal layering is defined by abundances of different minerals. So we have these darker layers, which are more pyroxene dominant, and then we have these lighter layers, which are more feldspar dominant. And this modal layering and as you go further east, the foliation defines a synform, which forms a canoe-like morphology. So we have this layered basin occurring. And this gives some interesting insights into how these evolved pods may have formed. And we'll talk about how layering has formed in different parts of the dike. And indeed, what we're hopefully going to be looking at in the future is how these different sections of the dike link up. But the traditional view of this being purely in situ fractionation is likely to be too simplistic, and a more dynamic emplacement model seems to be the case, which we'll allude to later on. And with that, we'll now look at the southern limb of the Younger Giant Dike complex, which Lucy will talk about.
Thanks, Rory. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about the southern section of the Younger Giant Dike, and it's outlined here in this red box. It's the green colour on the map here, and you can see sort of further down it splits into two separate limbs here, and it continues on further southwest before terminating somewhere down here. So next slide, please. So the southern limb is texturally and mineralogically identical to the troctolite that Rory's just described in the northern limb. But interestingly, unlike in the northern limb where we have these evolved pods, these are absent in the southern limb, but the southern limb is typified by instead sort of layered pods. So these are regions of the dike that are irregularly spaced throughout, which contain either igneous layering or igneous lamination. We mapped 4 of these pods and studied 2 in detail, Marraat and Narsarsuaq. So we'll first look at the pod at Marraat, and Marraat is the local name for this little bay here, outlined in the white box. This white box also roughly outlines the extent of the layered pod. So the Younger Giant Dike here attains a width of about 300 metres, and the layered pod is about 200 metres wide. So if we look to the right, on the sort of blown up geology of the area, this is looking north. The green here is the troctolite of the Younger Giant Dike, and then this light blue colour is indicating where the layering occurs. So you can see what I mean when I said that they are irregularly spaced. At least in the field, there was really no rhyme or reason as to why and when these occurred at these sections throughout the dike. And they're margined by a type of gabbro, which is classified as glomerocrystic or glomerophyric, which I'll show you in a few slides' time. So the layering at Marraat, Rory has just described the modal layering at Krydssø as forming this synformal shape. It's very similar here. You can see this beautiful synformal exposure on the coast, sort of cut right through the dike for us to see. And on the left here, the numbers here just for clarity indicating the order in which I'll walk things through with you in. So we'll start at the margin of the pod before going into where the layering begins, and we'll end up by really looking more closely at this synformal structure here. So the marginal troctolite, it contained these, you can see these sort of star-shaped clusters of plagioclase feldspar. The technical name is glomerocryst, but essentially they're just sort of stellate clusters of feldspar. It's thought that these form from supersaturation of the melt in plagioclase. And there's a variety of mechanisms which people think that this sort of structure forms. One is by synusis, so this is Greek syn meaning swim and usis meaning together. So it's thought that feldspar sort of floating in the melt, sort of drift together and align along similar crystal faces to form these star-shaped clusters. And these occur on both sides of the layered pod. And moving to the layered section, so we're moving towards the axis, looking southeast here. You can see even from a distance just how clearly defined these dark layers are. It's defined by layers very, very rich in olivine and pyroxene, so it's called pickrite, and it alternates with homogenous troctolite. We zoom in more, you can see it clearly. Here, and you can see clearly just how laterally continuous these layers are. Majority were very undisturbed and continuous. And then moving on to the center of the central axis, you can see that these layers sort of thicken down dip, and these olivine-rich bands define this beautiful synformal structure exposed on the coast. And one of the things I wanted to address while mapping was, I was thinking, how did this form? Igneous layering is still highly contested in the literature as to how exactly it forms. And it's something I would have liked to have done more lab work to address, but sadly COVID hasn't allowed that just yet, but maybe in the future. And if we move on to the Sassarlatoq pod, is on the far east of Tuttotooq. You can see this blue again is outlining the shape of this sort of ovoid pod at Sassarlatoq. We move to the next slide. So unlike at Marraat, where we saw the modal layers, Sassarlatoq is typified by this lamination of crystals. So the rock it's a plagioclase olivine magnetite cumulate, and the lamination is defined by a plagioclase crystal framework. And these plagioclase dip concentrically towards a horizontal central point. So you can think of this as sort of like a canoe or a basin-shaped morphology. And also present at Sassarlatoq are mafic enclaves. There are two types, and these are olivine magnetite cumulates. The first type is on the left here. You can see that these are elongate structures that are aligned parallel to the foliation in the rock. And the second type are actually cross-cut the foliation. And you can see the sort of cuspate margins, and they're plastically deforming the foliated troctolite. And Lot is going to go into more detail later on the technique which he used AMS, the anisotropy of magnetic susceptibility, to further investigate the features that we observe at Sassarlatoq.
Yeah, fantastic. So a little bit of talk from me. So my intentions when I was going into the field were to study closely the field relations of the component bodies of the Dyke swarm. So, well, what is the Dyke swarm? So, as mentioned earlier, it represents a later expression of magmatism in the Gardar Province, as evidenced by its cross-cutting relationships with the younger giant Dyke complex, and an interesting relationship with the Lamprophyric bodies, which you'll see from Alasdair in a minute. But importantly, the point I want to stress from the late Dyke swarms is that these intrusive bodies are not insignificant to the story. So the main characteristics of these features are their approximate 65-degree strike, as opposed to what you might see from the brown dykes, which are northwest-southeast striking. And they're also consistently around 5 meters in width, although they are seen to narrow in some parts to 10 centimeter injections, and then similarly expand up to around 30 meters across in some areas in the Gardar. So one of the most interesting aspects of the Dyke swarms is what are termed big feldspar dykes. These dykes are of varying widths, featuring feldspar xenocrysts or even anorthositic xenoliths of up to meter scales, which were just plucked from an anorthositic source. And they were all supported within a mafic ground mass. Other such rock types within the dike swarm also include the trachyte, as you can see here, which again is supported within a mafic ground mass. However, the trachytes have millimeter scale laths of feldspar. So the schematic to your right, as you can see, and other outcrops throughout our mapping areas, they have allowed us to demonstrate and determine a relative age of these dikes. So we have the big feldspar dikes at first, which were then followed by trachyte, microcyanites, and rhyolites. However, that's not the full story, because as you can see in the bottom corner, there are what are known as composite dikes. So dikes intruding into other dikes, which really adds a spice to the story. All of these relations, these field relations, are invaluable to our story, and in particular to Alasdair, as you will hear next.
So far we've just been talking about dikes on varying scales, but my focus for the mapping project was these Ultramafic Lamprophyres, and these in general are low degree mantle melts, often associated with carbonatites, but they're generally seen as diatremes or in a radius area. But the relationship with all the rest of the magmatism is really quite important. So just on this wee map here, the inset in the top right shows Tuttotooq in relationship to Narsarsuaq on the coast over the water. And the two localities on Tuttotooq, which are kind of pointed out there, they're generally associated with the bodies on Narsarsuaq. But the bodies on Narsarsuaq are seen to intrude through, or have been in place through, the younger giant dike in a place where it's extended out into a sill. So the younger giant dike meets the contact between the Eiriksfjord sandstones and the granitic basement and extends into a sill. It means that here in Narsarsuaq, the Ultramafic Lamprophyres definitively cross-cut that. But on Tuttotooq, the story is not quite so clear. So my aim was to go in and see, is it justified to count them as one and the same? And if not, then can we put a different age onto these? So just briefly, here they are in relationship to everything else that we've mapped. So just firstly, to focus on the eastern example of these, I went in and just produced a slightly more detailed map of both of these bodies. And the one on the east looks like this. So the top right photo there is just a typical example of the body itself. It's dark, fine-grained, with a lot of olivine and phlogopite, but mineralogy gets very complex very quickly. And so with just a hand lens, it was more of a focus on the structure and the field relationships, and with trying to put an age on this thing. So as it turned out, the key features here were an associated breccia pipe to the south and the dikes cross-cutting it. So you can see quite clearly that there are some of the dikes cross-cut both the breccia and the Lamprophyre. These are generally the later dikes in the dike swarm, so like the trachytes, and there's also some of the minor dikes who were cross-cutting. But there's also this big feldspar dike, which is in green on the bottom right. On this map, it's a bit tricky to see just due to the scale of it, but it looks like it's been cross-cut by this breccia pipe. But in fact, in the field, it would suggest what it looked like was that this pipe was diffusing into the breccia. So in general, the breccia was a granitic host, what you can see on the left there. But then in places it graded into a more mafic host, still with the same granite and quartz and basalt clasts from the underlying successions, but with this more mafic host. So this led me to the interpretation that actually the mafic component of the breccia is being sourced from the dykes. And with that being the case, quite nicely constrains both the breccia and therefore the Lamprophyre to the same age as the dykes one, which from the relationships elsewhere in the Gardar means it must lie between about 1.163 billion and 1.16 billion years old. So that was the first Lamprophyre looked at. On the other hand, here's the second. And in the literature, this was described as a body of indeterminate size, which was quite a polite way of putting that the exposure was horrific. But nonetheless, it was there to be seen and was able to go in and find the contacts. And importantly here, was able to find the contact to the south and to the north, which showed that the body lay completely within the younger giant dike, not on the intersection of the younger and the older giant dike, as was previously thought. But the contacts between the north and the south did differ. In the north, it was really quite sharp and curvy planar. That's what that picture on the left is. It's a bit hard to make out, but the bottom darker stuff is the Lamprophyre, and the top light stuff, there we go, is the younger giant dike, and you can see some of the glimmer crysts in there as well. But then the contact in the south, the reason for there not being a picture of that is it was just a complex melange which you couldn't really make out without being right up to it. On top of that, there was also a change in the mineralogy throughout the body. Not in the base ultramafic mineralogy, but there was poikilotic minerals across it, which varied from plagioclase, biotite and amphibole in the south to just biotite in the north. And that picture on the right is a section where there was these amphiboles, which were really quite prominent in the sample. So putting all this together, my interpretation of this is that this must have been a xenolith hosted within the younger giant dike and not being in place through it. And the reason for that is it seems to have interacted with the younger giant dike. And so in terms of the timing for this then, it must have been in place just before the younger giant dike, so that it hadn't completely lithified so that it couldn't interact with the younger giant dike. However, that's very brief, and I put a lot of thought, well, I say a lot, maybe not loads, but I've put some thought into this, so if you do have more questions about that, feel free to ask them at the end. But overall then, as a wee conclusion to this section, tying it all together, this was the map that we've produced, and we were largely focusing on the giant dikes, but there was also the Lamprophyres. And by the time we'd reached the end of our field season, we were feeling pretty happy with the questions that we'd answered in the field, and I was quite happy with my Lamprophyres. We'd had a good look at all the layering that's going on, and we'd been pretty keen to get in and do some lab work. And I mean, we keep blaming COVID, but we are a bit gutted not to have done more. Nonetheless, though, a lot has been able to get in some pretty interesting data and can extend the story a bit more. And yeah, I think he'll talk through that now, and it is really quite interesting. So I'll hand over to him.
All right, so as Alasdair said, I was lucky enough to get into the lab before COVID happened, and I still have some access to it now. And basically what I've been looking at is I've been using rock magnetics, and particularly AMS, so anisotropic magnetic susceptibility, to try and piece together a story as to how the younger giant dike might have formed, because it's quite a unique structure and we don't really see them much throughout Earth history. So it's quite a geodynamically interesting question. But first, I'll explain to you guys what AMS is. Ultimately, it is a way to measure and quantify rock fabrics. And so this is particularly useful if you're in a place that isn't a gneiss or a schist, where you can put your hand on it and point and take a strike and dip quite easily. But it's really useful in places where you can't pick those out by eye. It gives a bit of an insight as to how the rocks might have formed. AMS is useful because it also can pick up a foliation and the lineation, so it can give you a flattening direction and a direction of shear or a stretching direction. And to hone in on that point, there's a lot of different variables that you can use to characterize and pick out pieces of information from AMS samples. But the most important for this talk is what are called oblate as opposed to prolate samples. Oblate samples are where the AMS, so the anisotropy, so the difference from it being a perfect sphere to the shape that it's supposed to be, or the shape that it is in the field. An oblate is a more pancake-shaped structure, and a prolate is a more cigar-shaped structure. So it's more stretching. So the pancake is, again, this flattening idea, and the prolate is more this stretching idea. So how do you collect AMS? When we were in the field, as we said at the beginning, we collected a whole bunch of samples. Those samples you then core into cylinders that are about 2 centimeters wide and 2 centimeters long. You then cut those up to have multiple specimens of each sample that you've collected. You run them all through a machine that spins them within a magnetic field, and the machine spits out how it interprets that specimen reacted to the magnetic field. This red is just a representative example of what you might get as a foliation within that specimen. You collect multiple of them and you average them together to get a statistically significant result. So you can be reasonably confident that that is what the foliation is in that rock. So what carries AMS in rocks? Essentially all minerals. Any minerals that have a shape will have some form of AMS, be it along their cleavage directions or be it along the shape of their crystal. In terms of rock magnetics, you can classify all minerals into 3 large groups. The first of which is the paramagnetic minerals. So these are biotites, olivines. So it's anything that has any iron within the crystal structure. And they have a very weak AMS response. So they're hard to pick out, but they're there. The other type that is very common is diamagnetic minerals. So these are minerals that don't have any iron within their crystal structure. They have an even weaker response, and it opposes the magnetic field, and that's why we call it a negative field. And these are your main rock building minerals, such as quartz, feldspars, and the like. Finally, if you have any of these, they will really dominate your response, but these are called ferromagnetic minerals. And ferromagnetic minerals are minerals that are typically iron oxides. So think of your magnetites or your hematites. And these are really strong, they have a really strong response to AMS. In the younger giant dike, handily enough, the magnetite is a very common phase, so it will dominate the response, and that makes our interpretation of how the AMS works slightly easier. So I'm going to test your map reading skills now, but because there's quite a bit of information on this map. All of the lines, or all of the arrows that we see on the map on the left here, I'll zoom into it, are lineations. So this is this stretching direction, which can be interpreted as a direction that the rock was flowing in, very roughly speaking, before it crystallized fully. And then to the right, I've got the foliations, which are these classic strike and dip symbols that you see on a map. And these are your flattening or your foliation direction, which you typically think of what you see in a schist or a gneiss along Scotland. But there's quite a bit of information here, so I'm going to go through it quite structurally. So we're going to go from the contact of the dike inwards, and ultimately to try and give you the small pieces of information that I've used to try and make our culminating idea of how these dikes may form. So if we start out at the contacts of the younger giant dike, what we see are these very subvertical foliations, so these flattening directions that are almost parallel to the contact. And this occurs at various points in the dike. So these arrows point towards where these insets are from. And you see that these are subparallel and almost vertical and parallel to the dike. So these are oblate shapes, and they indicate a component of pure shear flattening that's occurring in the dike. And essentially what that means is the dike is probably growing through some form of inflation. So think of blowing up a balloon. As you keep pumping more magma into this body, it starts squishing the sides, and the sides start expanding. And you can preserve that squishing in the contacts of the dike. Within that marginal zone that I discussed at the beginning of our talk, this is a thin section of what that looks like. Ultimately, what you see are these, typically the chilled margin or the marginal zones of dikes in terms of rock magnetics are thought to be places where you can preserve the emplacement flow of the dike. So how this dike originally came in. So that's why that's quite an interesting place to look at when it comes to trying to understand how they formed. So, however, unlike typical areas, this area most likely has slightly more complicated history, mainly because of the size of these dikes. What we see in the thin section, if I zoom into it, is we see evidence of these boundaries that are recrystallized, and we see quite a lot of overgrowth and intergrowths of crystals along the length of this section, which suggests that there is some form of recrystallization and some later equilibration after these crystals came to be, which suggests that the original fabric that we have preserved in the AMS was probably overprinted. So if we look at what this looks like structurally, what we see is we have these lineations in the map. If I zoom in, we have these lineations that are, again, parallel to the contact, near the contact, and they deviate to be almost perpendicular once you start getting in towards the center troctolite of the dike. This occurs if in a place where we have more samples. You can see this clearly as well. We have the sub-parallel direction of this lineation, so this stretching direction that deviates towards a more perpendicular direction nearer the center of the dike. So what we think this may be preserving is some form of alignment of this AMS towards a thermal or a chemical gradient. So obviously, the center of the dike will most likely be hotter than the sides of the dike. And this means that there is a gradient towards the middle, and that might be what is being preserved with these deviations of the AMS. However, it might also be some form of chemical gradient. So as we've been alluding in the glomerocrystic or these stellate feldspars and the crop-seam, there does seem to be some evidence of saturation within these rocks. And in some of the marginal facies as well, you get what are these dendritic, quite beautiful dendritic plagioclases perpendicular to the contact of the dike. So that might be what is being preserved here as well. If we move out of the marginal zone and in towards the middle of the dike, we'll first go into the foliated pod. This is what I did my dissertation on. And what we see, again, just as a reminder, the foliation in the field is defined by a framework of plagioclase crystals. As Lucy said, the other primary crystals in this rock are olivines and magnetites. So any forces that acted on the plagioclase will have acted on these other primary crystals as well. And that might be useful because the AMS will be recording what the magnetites have experienced. So what foliation and lineation direction the magnetite has. What we then see is that the magnetites in this inset here, which are recording these blue strike and dip symbols, have a parallel direction to the foliation that we observed in the field with these black symbols. So that's quite useful because that means that they are probably recording the same process. And what we couldn't identify in the field because it's very hard to spot are magmatic lineations in the AMS, and they all plunge towards that central horizontal point at the middle of this canoe-shaped basin. And what that means is that there is some form of stretching or some form of flow that I'll get into later towards this central point. So the big question is what caused that flow? So I'm going to show you another thin section of what this rock looks like under the microscope. They're really quite beautiful rocks. But if just as we zoom in, what we see are these really nice euhedral laths of plagioclase. We have the olivines and the nice euhedral magnetites as well. We don't have any mechanical twinning within these rocks. So the twins within the plagioclase, the black and white stripes are really nice and straight. There's no slump folding, so there's no deformation in terms of S-shapes or anything like that. And there's no fractures or mechanical twins within the plagioclases as well. So what that suggests is it's probably not an in situ process or a subsolidus flow process like what you get in a metamorphic rock that is causing the layering in this area. Just to reiterate that point, this is a sample from the Bushveld complex in South Africa. And here, if I zoom into it, we have these very strongly deformed twins. So you have these nice wavy plagioclase stripes. We have these fractures running through the plagioclases, and you can see a lot of overgrowth around these crystals where there's some form of recrystallization occurring. And what we then can determine from that is we still don't know what the flow is. So we have to look further to other pieces of information. The second piece of information I'll show to you guys is what Lucy mentioned were these mafic enclaves. So these are these very dark rocks that we have here. And again, if you zoom in here, what you see is as this mafic enclave is sinking through this rock, it seems to be pulling down plagioclase crystals with it. And what that tells you is that these plagioclase crystals, or this foliated zone, would have been formed before the mush fully crystallized. So it must have been somewhat maneuverable and movable as these enclaves came through. Alongside that, we have this consistent lineation in the AMS that all plunge towards the central point. And we also have these tiling structures of these really nicely euclideal plagioclase minerals. And what that seems to be the case for us is that this probably is some form of sedimentary style deposition at the liquid mush interface. And that's a bit of a lot of words to put into place, but think of it a bit as like a river flowing with a bunch of sediments within it. And as that river slows down, or the flow slows down, that sediment is settled down towards the bottom. And if you ever walk through a wet beach, you can still stomp your feet through that wet beach, and the quartz crystals and whatever the beach is made of will still move around the pressure that you're causing. So to put that into perspective of how it's happening in the dike, what we see is most likely we could be having these large convection cells within the dike. And at the bottom of these convection cells that are carrying all of these crystals that are forming in the middle of the dike, the flow is decreasing. And like you have in a river, the sediments are crystallizing or are being deposited at the bottom of this cell in what is this mushy crystal pile at the bottom. So that's how we think the layering formed. Obviously, as we've seen in the maps, the layering doesn't occur everywhere. So another key piece of the puzzle is to try and figure out what's occurring at the rest of this area. What we see in these two transects that I've taken across, one at a narrowing point and one at a wider point, as we see in the narrowing, in the foliation, we see a synformal structure. So it's dipping towards this way and coming back up here. But that structure is lost in the narrowing point of the dike. And that's quite interesting. And if we look at delineation, so this stretching direction, we see that they are pretty much aligned parallel to the strike of the dike and very gently inclined towards the southwest. However, again, it's slightly more complicated at this narrow point. What this consistent lineation tells us is there's probably some form of dominant migration within this dike towards the east-northeast. And if you remember Alasdair talking about the Lamprophyres, towards the east-northeast of Tuttotooq, we have the Narsarsuaq sill. So what we might be recording here is a flow from the dike towards that sill and filling up that sill as there's still magma present within this system. But a big question that we still have left is, why is there a difference between that narrower point and the wider point from the dike? So is that narrowing an effect of tectonic forces that are acting there, or was there maybe a wall present? And what I mean with that, I'll put into place after in the next slides, where we culminate all the pieces of information I've given you to try and piece together how this dike might have formed. So our hypothesis at the moment is that this dike didn't really form as a classic dike structure. So what you might have had is a group of laterites or tube-like structures that were in place as this system was opening up. And because at the contacts we saw this inflation, these blow up like balloons and get wider. And within them, we have convection cells that are forming layering if the conditions are right, and no layering if the conditions aren't right. And as we're producing a marginal zone, we have a hotter center, and that's what we're seeing in the AMS. And finally, these will keep inflating until they coalesce and the walls between them are lost. And as this is crystallizing, we have this dominant migration towards the sill somewhere towards the northeast. And we have a interspersed set of layered sections and non-layered sections that are jotted about with each other. If we then cut this section to present day erosion and compare it to what we see in the map, we might be able to pick out these pods across the zone. And so I've just drawn a few red circles around here. And what we see is we might be seeing these layered pods in different stages of them coalescing and inflating together across this dike. A big question that we still have, and we still don't have a complete answer to, is why do we get layering in here and why do we have more evolved pods towards the north? So we want to try and marry these two together. And one of our hypotheses that we have at the moment is there might be some form of compaction occurring. And so just the same as when you're squishing around your rocks, the beach, and the water is squeezing out from between the pore spaces in the sand, a similar process might be occurring in the layered sections. And so where we have these plagioclase crystals and the magnetites and olivines getting squished together as more and more of them are being piled up on top of each other and essentially filter pressing out a more evolved interstitial melt. And these might be feeding the evolved pods that will be further above it. And so potentially, if we were to look higher up, these might actually be the evolved pods. So to conclude, everything that we've done together, culminating lab work and the field work, we've been able to tightly constrain the relative ages of the Lamprophyres to 2 different ages. And this means that they can provide key windows into the Gardar mantle throughout the evolution of the rift. Also, we've been able to see that the later Dyke zone really is quite a significant component of Gardar magmatism. And finally, with that homogeneous finger, we were able to see that the younger giant Dyke intruded in at least 2 phases, crystallized under different regimes to form the marginal zone, the homogeneous troctolite, and the layered, and also the evolved pods. And finally, as we saw in that little cartoon that I drew, it might not have intruded as a classic Dyke. And really what's important to piece together this story is we need to collect more and more structural data to make this story more complete. So with that, we'd like to really thank the EGS for their support, as well as the other funding bodies that we got money from. And we'll open the floor to any questions you may have.
Wow, that was, yeah. Can we unmute everybody to give a round of applause? I think I have an option to all, but ask all to unmute. There we go. Clap, clap, clap. Well done. Hey guys, that was absolutely fantastic. We're going to open the floor to questions now, and I do believe Brian should be here. Brian Upton should be here. Brian, are you there? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I can't see your name, but are you there?
Yeah, Bodil's here, I think.
Bodil, okay, could everybody apart from, in that case, apart from Brian, Bodil, turn mute themselves again, so we don't hear the mixer going on in the background or something. Okay, Brian, the floor is yours. Brian, I think is your microphone not working?
Microphone seems to be on, but yeah.
That is such a shame. Okay, Brian, if you get your microphone working, then please do it. Just type a little chat note to let us know. In that case, shall we ask, are there any other questions? You can either type them or ask away. Right, in that case, I'm going to ask some questions. I was busily making some notes through that, and I also had Google Earth up as well, so I was doing a sort of flight through your area as you were talking about it, which was, it looks fantastic. There are a few things that sort of piqued my interest, and one of them in particular, and Lot, I think you touched on this, but Lisa, down at Sisalutuk, can you say it please?
Assorutit, yes.
Thank you. Down there where Lucy was describing the layered intrusions, and you were describing those as well, Lot. they had these little mafic enclaves in them.
Yeah.
I mean, this may be a very simple question, forgive me if it is, but what causes the formation? What have the mafic enclaves for? You're giving the
it's a great question. It's not a simple answer either. Essentially, we don't really know. What we think might be occurring here is that there's some form of segregation that's occurring in the magma that is splitting up a more felsic component that's producing these anorthosites that we saw in Rory's area, and the more mafic component is producing these mafic enclaves that then sink through. And so they're really, really very dense materials. So they're olivines and magnetite. So these would really sink quite quickly through a magma as well. But ultimately, we don't really know. We'd have to do some further research to try and piece them together.
Yeah, okay, well, that's good. Does anybody else out there have anything to ask?
I think I saw a raised hand just now. Frank, if I remember the name correctly.
Yep, that's me, Frank Rooney. Yeah, that was a fascinating talk. Thanks very much. That brought back a lot of nostalgia from me. I was in that area 42 years ago, 1978, and did my undergraduate mapping just north of where you are. I spent a day just north of Narsarsuaq on the mountain there, among the magmas there, with some really weird formations, really weird minerals among these alkaline rocks there. There was a wonderful sodalite that changes color from green to red in the sunlight and whatnot. Did you find any of those exotics in the island where you were, or was that just confined further north to that? Were there any outliers in that area there?
So I'll start this question. Someone else might be able to give a bit more information, but these really highly evolved rocks with these very unique compositions are really quite isolated to Tuttutooq-llimaussaq and those mountains that you were seeing in the area. On the island itself, there is a central complex where you have these more evolved melts, but we don't reach this stage where you have these beautiful, very strange minerals occurring. Probably the most evolved melt that we see is in the older giant dike, where we have these nepheline cyanites. So the quartz there's not enough silica in the rock for these nepheline, for the quartz to form. And so we produce these nephelines. And so they look almost the same. But that's about as exotic as the minerals got there.
I remember when I discovered the giant feldspar dikes in my mapping area, I thought I discovered a new rock type, and I went rushing back to the base camp, and then in the Danish geological survey memoir, it described it in detail, and I was crestfallen, I can tell you.
Those dikes caused us much pain as well, don't worry.
Is there anybody else out there who would like to ask something?
It's Neil here.
Hi, Neil.
Greetings. Thanks, guys. That was great. Could I ask a practical question? Obviously, when you'd taken all your boxes of food out there, you've eaten all your food after 6 weeks. I wanted to know how you made a decision on which rocks to bring back. And what was I just wondered if that wrestling competition was part of the decision on which rocks to bring back.
I guess the simple answer to that is that we weren't very good at deciding which rocks to take back, and we sort of just brought back everything. One of the problems we had when we were going back is that we had too many rocks for our boat, and so we had to do 2 trips on the boat on the way back because the boat started sinking as we loaded all of our rocks onto it. And our pallet was so heavy as we were bringing it back that it came back to St Andrews with the base shattered from the weight of, was it 100 kilos or so of rock or something?
Yeah, 1.6.
1.6 tons of rocks we brought back. Which was, yeah, so the simple answer is that we didn't really decide. I think every sample that we took in the field, we did end up bringing back to St Andrews. And different people took different amounts of samples back. So Lot and myself were looking at doing dissertation projects on the area. And so we brought back the bulk of the samples. And then we had select samples from each other part of the mapping area, such as Lucy's area. We had more transects through that as well.
So yeah, I mean, just to build on that, the AMS technique requires quite a lot of samples, so it's not like geochem where you can just grind stuff up and you only need a little bit. For the AMS, you need quite a huge, quite a large range of samples, so you can kind of justify getting all those. Although, yeah, we did definitely pushed the palette, and we pushed it to the limit. We remember on the last day before shipping, going around to some of the fishermen, just seeing if they'd have an old fish tray to see if we could put some of our rocks in. Yeah, there was a lot of rocks.
We had to ask the local brewery to use their forklift truck to transport it across this small town.
Thank you.
I've got a question, Tom, if that's okay. It was a question for Alasdair about the breccia. We were having a little bit of chat about it during the presentation. I just really would like to hear a little bit more about what you think actually was going on, the kind of timescales of that, and you know, the order that things were happening. And is that something that's ever been spotted anywhere else? I don't ever remember hearing about a breccia with kind of 2 different host magmas involved.
Yeah, so I've not heard of it happening anywhere else. It's not to say that I just missed it, but that was, yeah, when I first saw it in the field, I was, I didn't want to think that was happening because it seems like it was too close to have a breccia in place and then to have a dike that could feed into it. In terms of, because we're dealing on, well, billions of years, I suppose, here, it was kind of, it seemed a bit too fortuitous that they were both at least partially liquid at the same time. But looking at it, this dike, the big feldspar dike, was really quite prominent leading up to the breccia. And although these dikes do jump about a bit, they on echelon and will be apart for a part and then disappear. This one, it did seem to get up to the dike, go part of the way, up to the breccia, part of the way into it, and just stop. The boundary of the breccia itself wasn't quite so clear, so it did make determining it a bit more tricky. And so I was skeptical to start with, but there was a couple of other features which convinced me. Well, it was the fact as well that the mafic and the granitic host to the breccia, there was the gradational bit between them, and it did seem to be focused along where you could see these dikes. Some of the later dikes, although they clearly cross-cut the breccia, there was points where you could see that liquid from the breccia definitely then was filling in joints within these later dikes, and just cracks. And so that one I'm not quite so sure about, because maybe just with having the dike in place, there's enough heat to mobilize some liquid or something from within the breccia. But again, that led me to think that there's definitely both liquid at the same time. And then there was on the last day that I spent at it, there was a little, because there was 3 small ponds essentially surrounding this lamprophyre. For any of you that are ornithologists out there as well, there was a wee red phalarope who was just doing its circles in one of them. Anyway, there was a outcrop just kind of on a little overhanging part next to one of these ponds, where you could quite clearly see a cluster quartzite surrounded by a thin rim of the felsic host, and then surrounded by the more mafic host as well. And so that, when I saw that, I was like, okay, there's definitely a multiple stage thing happening here. How many stages? Exactly the 2 sort of stage thing is probably a bit simplistic, but overall, that was what I ended up believing. I don't know if that answers the question, but
that's absolutely brilliant. It just looks like an amazing feature. What size was it again? What diameter of it?
So it was about 50 meters to 100 meters wide for both the Lamprophyre and for the breccia. They were about that. Though, yeah, the contacts weren't explicitly exposed everywhere, so it was in that ballpark region.
Yeah, cool.
Will had a question that he asked
Yes.
About what further laboratory work is proposed. And so I think each of us will have a slightly different thing that they'll want to say. But for myself, what I'm doing my research masters on is trying to collect some different types of rock magnetics to see if we can pick out what they call sub-fabrics. So there might be other processes such as this interstitial melt propagation that we might be able to see. And I'd also love to do a bit of geochemical work, so some probe work and some whole rock geochemistry to pick out exactly what we were asking earlier about these mafic enclaves and exactly how they formed and what their part of the story is.
Right.
And to add to that, I'm using the same techniques that Lot talked about in the southern limb of the Younger Giant Dyke, so AMS studies, and I'm applying that to the evolved pods in the north, trying to look at the Assorutit pod, which is the most evolved one, and also the narrowing between the two pods, to try and see if we see this same lobe-like pattern occurring there, to try and marry the north and south together.
Brilliant. Okay, last chance for any questions.
Thank you.
If you have a question, just speak up. And I don't think Brian and Vogel's mic is actually turned on, unfortunately. So it looks like you got off lightly this evening in that respect. Brian, if you can hear us, please email them your queries and questions. And I'd love to know what you have to say. So I'll just wrap up with a vote of thanks. And that was really, really extraordinary. It was absolutely fantastic, and certainly on par with any other lectures that we've received. And given that you guys haven't even finished your degrees, well, I think, who was it who has finished their degree? I was doing another one, right? Okay, well, you're doing your second degree now, so there we go. It's a fantastic first class job, and I hope that's what you end up with as a result. So you've taken us on a trip, not just literally showing us what you've had to do to get out there. It's always nice to see the logistics and the effort that you've had to put in to actually organize this. It's monumental, and I know from having been out to Greenland myself what effort you have to go into. So it's clear to me that you guys have actually worked really well as a team of 5, and that is brilliant. And that sort of sums up what science is about, really. It's not just the individual's work, it's teamwork, and you've obviously sort of standing on the shoulders of giants, and relation to Frank, who's been there, to Brian, who's worked out there, and all the other people who've worked out there. And I certainly hope that you continue in that theme by becoming one of the giants that other people can stand on your shoulders, and you get the chance to do all this other work that you've sadly not been able to because of COVID. But regardless of that, you've clearly produced a fantastic piece of work. I'm no EGS petrologist. I certainly have learnt an awful lot, and what I think really shows that this is a great presentation is I was making notes along here, and I had a question, and it was, are the wide parts of the injections, pod injection centers, are they injection centers or fractionating due to the size? But you kind of answered that before, I even had a chance to ask it. So you presented it in such a way that you were answering questions, and it's very, very clear from that point of view. I think you've also shown that it's a fantastic part of the world to go to. And I don't doubt you would agree that there's more work to be done there, and hopefully your work will inspire others to carry on what you've been doing. So thank you very much, all 5 of you, Lucy, Alasdair, Rory, Rob, Lot, thank you very much. It's been fantastic, and it's really nice to see the product of when Edinburgh Geological Society puts a bit of money your way, and it really does go to a good cause. So well done. Thank you.
Thank you for your kind words and support.
Well deserved.
I found a receipt just about a year ago among a pile of old papers, and in 1978 we spent 3 months. 4 of us spent 3 months there for just over £3,000. Living on porridge, probably.
won't ask how much your expedition cost, guys, because but you've done certainly very well to bring in the money to make it take place. I think we can leave now.